Today's presentation is, we're talking about a community collaboration within the U.S. federal government with industry and academia and standards organizations. He made it work. He brought us the connector.
Oh, okay.
Specifically, how many of you, whenever you've been trying to do your job and you were thinking security, somebody viewed you as an obstructionist? Yeah, you're just trying to do your job, trying to do the right thing. Well, we're here to say that more and more people are basically awakening to the reality that says if you didn't factor security in up front, you're going to have trouble down the line. We talk about security enhanced processes and practices. I'm doing this today with Stan Wisseman, who is one of the chapter presidents for Owasp. He's also on our software assurance teams, chairing one of our working groups that we do with industry and federal agencies and standards bodies. And the reason that we've started this whole activity has been to really focus on the fact that our enterprises today do not just bring in that they develop themselves, and they don't usually just bring in things that they bought from somebody else, but it's really a mix of those things. And when you start looking at what that is, I typically, people think, well, I'm buying from this reputable supplier that's here, but are you really aware of who that supplier's supply chain is? And that's why you have to be aware of, as a consumer, you take on a different role rather than just being a normal developer or an acquirer that you've got.
I'm sorry, we're recording, so you can't walk too far out.
Okay. Well, but we also know that most of the time in-house we bring in something, and even if it's nothing more than just the glue code, bringing in those applications that we brought and said we're going to make them work for our consumers. We do development. In fact, from a security perspective, that's usually the best place to exploit an enterprise is the glue code, because they weren't really thinking. Believe it or not, from a normal development perspective, the COTS perspective, even the open source software, we're finding out people are becoming more security aware so that there is something. But just take that in consideration, that when we talk about quality, you should also be thinking security, and it should never be as a standalone function what we do. That's why we look at security enhanced capabilities. And we look at today's global supply chain, because that's the reality. We are in a global market. The software that you have inside your enterprise or who you're delivering typically involves those across the globe. But we have to be able to look at software engineering, quality assurance, testing, project management. They must explicitly address security risks that are posed by exploitable software. You can look at all the other things, and we're going to talk about this application software itself is what's putting us at risk if we haven't factored that in, because our traditional processes do not look at it. And mitigating the supply chain risk is not just a developer's problem. We can blame it on the developer, say, they're the ones who did it to me. No, it turns out that we as consumers are typically part of the problem as well. So we have to look at our enterprise risks that are stemming from the supply chain are influenced by suppliers and the acquisition projects. When we talk in terms of risk management, in terms of our acquisition projects, we typically view as the risk to my project, meaning can I deliver on cost, schedule, and performance, without understanding the true residual risk that's being passed on to the consumer, the user of this. And so I'm going to be asking you, at the end of the day, look at the projects that you're involved in. 5 years from now, will you be able to say, I left my organization or the consumer in a more secure, resilient mode, or was it one that was just good enough to get the customer to sign off on without them truly understanding the residual risk? And that's why we're saying that our practices that we have today must span development as well as acquisition. And we have to start looking at derived requirements or non-security requirements. They must be elicited and considered. So we're going to look at what is it that we as developers or as consumers should be doing to make sure that this is factored in what we're doing. But we also know practices alone in this arena of security are not enough. We have to have scale in terms of more comprehensive diagnostic capabilities used throughout the life cycle so that developers, testers, even consumers can better understand the code that they have. It's really about providing transparency for more informed decision making. The reality is we are never going to be 100% risk-free in this environment, but you must be informed. You must have information to understand your residual risk exposure so that you can take action to do that. Today, we as consumers have no information, and we're stuck with that. And what we've done, why is it? Because software is so robust. We do a lot of things with it. We've been developing our applications, but then people started thinking about security, so we built firewalls. We put up DMZs. But now what do we do for a web application? Hey, we're finding ways to punch right on through that. In fact, I've gone to conferences where people are saying, this is how you get around your firewall. It's like, we're doing that because we're trying to reach out with the web-facing applications, our services, our connectivity to our partners. And a lot of this we do both in-house and also the outsourcing. We want to connect with our partners. So we're doing it to ourselves, but we didn't design those applications to be either coexistent with, on the same platform with other applications, and many of those early applications were not ever envisioned to even be on the web, but now we've made them web-enabled. And so rather than attempt to break into and through your security barriers that you have, and again, I know many of you have firewalls and DMZs, and you've put on security controls of the software, but the reality is we're just around them. Why should I bother to punch through your security? Because we know, and it depends on which source you're reading, between 75 to 90% of all hacking today is at the application level. It's not going through your security controls. Most exploitable software vulnerabilities today are attributable to non-secure programming practices. But we don't catch it in testing. And we say that functional correctness must be exhibited even when software is subjected to the abnormal hostile conditions. Most involved in tests make sure that it works correctly under the normal situations. The reality is we've got a lot of clueless users out there and they can do things to us. But we're finding out more and more we've got people just like to see what they can do to break things. We did that as students. We're finding out people are still doing it. And today it's even sponsored and there's criminal activities behind it as well. So that's why in an era riddled with asymmetric cyber attacks, any claims about system reliability, integrity, or safety must include provisions for the bill of security.
What do you mean by asymmetric? What's your definition
Of asymmetric, you've got of being able to attack you at any place and time of their choosing, and I'll get into some of the ways that we describe that. And that's why we say, well, the security controls are necessary. You want to put on your padlocks, you want to be able to put in your firewalls, but it's not sufficient in today's environment. There's no need to break the locks when you can gain it through exploitable products. So when we talk about software assurance, certainly we want to be able to say, address defects. And in fact, there are people say it's all you need is 100% defect-free code and you'll have security. Well, that assumes that malicious code or malware is a defect. But I will tell you, most of the time it runs better than software. In fact, you can't even detect it in most cases. So we're dealing with anything that might be embedded in software anytime during its life cycle that could be exploited. And unfortunately, we're finding out that some products today are coming into the market even before they've been deployed and put into use already have malicious code in them. And that's a challenge for us. And CIOs have identified that as a big challenge. You know, when you do individual questions of individual CIOs and you ask them, are your networks and systems secure? Absolutely. But if you make it anonymous and do a survey, turns out that it's not the rich features we're looking for, but it's making sure that we have reliable software that functions as promised and software that's free from security vulnerabilities and malicious code. Because CIOs are understanding their enterprises being put at risk through the software. And Deloitte came out with their global security survey on shifting the paradigm. And this was at the end of 2007 to focus what is it that financial institutions should be focusing on in 2008. And it's well aligned with what we're doing, but there's specific that decisions in software development lifecycle significantly impact financial operations. Even those of you who are not doing software development, the development is affecting your financial operations. And they identified the fact that they realized that application security is the #1 issue for CIOs. Information security team must continuously raise the bar on secure software development by examining software development internally, demanding trustworthy software from vendors and business, and ensuring that applications have adequate controls and audit trails. And they're wanting to make sure that people can start focusing on the development activities even as consumers. And that's why they says, as organizations acquire, outsource, and implement a host of applications, they must recognize and mitigate software security risk. And that means ensuring secure code integrated at development stage. So you're going to see more and more focus from CIOs asking, how was this code developed? And so the needs for software assurance. We recognize the fact that the life cycle for software introduces many opportunities to either poorly designed code or to insert malicious code. Both government and businesses rely on commercial off-the-shelf products, both from foreign and non-vetted domestic suppliers. Now, it depends on what industry you're in, because you're going to hear some people say, well, you know, foreign's bad. No, it's not. That's the reality. We are in a global market. And you will hear some people say, we need to start bringing things back home. Well, what we're really dealing with non-vetted domestic suppliers, just because you're US based, you have all US developers, even many with security clearances. If they don't know how to develop secure products, they're just as much able to put you at risk as others. So the idea of saying bringing it back home is not going to make it better by itself. But offshore magnify the risk. And you have to be aware of it. And it's not just because you might find some malicious insiders there, but it's really about the laws are different. And we've talked to some companies that say they're willing and they know part of their business model. They lose 70% of their intellectual property by offshoring it because they can't protect it once it goes there. So they've tried to bring back the core of what they're trying to do back home to make sure they're controlling that. But consumers, and that's both in government and industry, we lack information. Suppliers' process capabilities are fundamental business practices of controlling their development. We cannot adequately determine the security risks that are posed by the supplier's products and their services, both to the acquisition project or, more importantly, to the operations that are enabled by that software later on. There's a limited number of practitioners that have the requisite skills in this area. As we go around to many universities to talk about making sure that this gets incorporated into computer science courses, software engineering courses, MIS courses, and other IT-related fields, we're actually finding out there's a bigger risk, and maybe many of your companies have found this is true. We're actually having declining enrollments in IT and software-related curriculum. And why is that? Well, there's a misperception out there that says that if I go into this field, my job in the future is at risk of being offshored and outsourced. But do you realize that today we have a larger demand for software and IT-related disciplines than we had even during the dot-com boom? You just have to look at where they are, but the perception is we've been offshoring that, but actually we have a greater demand for it here today. So what happens, employers as they try to find these people can't find them in their market where they're at, and so even when they tried to backshore it, bring it back home, they found out I can't find the requisite workforce here, so they kept it overseas. That's like a self-fulfilling prophecy then. So we've got to understand that we have a demand for this. Now, if you're purely a programmer, I will say that's where you're at risk, because we really are looking for the things beyond that. It's like in the old days, it assumed that you knew how to type. It wasn't that you were hired as a typist, but you had to have that skill. If you're coming into this field of anything software, IT related, there's an assumption that you understand something about programming. You may not be hired as a programmer, you may for part of it, but if you think that that's the only thing you're going to do, perhaps that is the one that's at risk. We are looking for people who are network administrators. They're looking for requirements engineers, the test engineers. These are the types of skills that we need that are core competencies within our enterprises here. And we also know that few process improvement capability appraisal methods even address security. And our current education and training is lacking, as I mentioned. So what if we change the paradigm to really provide more code transparency? Well, it would say that government, working with industry and academia, actually raised expectations for product integrity and the requisite levels of security, that we helped advance the methodologies for software assurance diagnostic, as well as promoted those methodologies and tools. And it means that our acquisition managers and the users would factor in the risks that are posed by our supply chain as part of their trade space. Again, you'll never be 100% secure, but it says we have to have information about suppliers' capabilities, their processes, and we have to be able to have information about evaluated products. The reality is most people cannot evaluate products to the level they'd like to. But I will tell you, as a taxpayer, one week when we went around to 2 different federal labs testing software, they were testing the exact same product. And I said, you know, as a taxpayer, what's wrong with this picture? Why is it that we can't share information about evaluated products? And what if suppliers actually delivered quality products with the requisite levels of integrity and made assurance claims about those products relative to safety, security, and dependability? Well, that would mean to have relevant standards to be used on which to base the business practices, because today we don't have any minimal levels of responsible practice for software. Jeff pointed that out earlier, said we need to have some standards in this area. What means that we'd have to have qualified tools used throughout the life cycle to enable both developers and testers to mitigate the security risk, and that we'd have standards and qualified tools to be used to certify software. Now, believe it or not, we actually postured our organization to be able to start setting this up by working with industry labs. We actually have organizations who are willing to certify software relative to the standards that we'd give them, the criteria that would be tested, about relative to having qualified test tools. And I'm going to talk about how it is that we're going about working with NIST and other standards bodies to actually qualify tools to be used in this so that you can make assertions about the quality of your products. And it would also mean that we're in a position to be able to have qualified test engineers in this area as well. That's the way our program's been set up. Probably one of the only guys who have part of my job description signed out by the president that said, as part of our national strategy to secure cyberspace, that DHS will promulgate a public-private effort to support best practices in the area of promoting integrity, security, and reliability in software code development. And the way that we structured that program is to focus on trustworthiness, dependability, and conformance, and again, working with the various bodies to do that. And if you want to find out more about that, you can go on to Wikipedia, type in software assurance, get the various definitions and links to all the various initiatives that we have. But it basically is looking at no exploitable vulnerabilities exist, either maliciously or unintentionally inserted, and that we have justifiable confidence that software, when executed, functions as intended. So from a software assurance perspective, it is not purely a software engineering discipline. If you go to IEEE software engineering body of knowledge, they do not address safety or security as a normative part. So we literally had to go to the safety and security community to derive the practices. The Project Management Institute provided through the PMBOK their body of knowledge, and we've integrated the various disciplines, not to create a new discipline called software assurance, but says these are all the requisite practices that we need, and to be able to go back to them and to be able to provide the enhancers, like with IEEE with software engineering. We're creating new knowledge areas for the SWBOK. We've identified changes to the existing knowledge areas and the new knowledge area as well. And the way we've organized is through people, process, and technology. It's every good initiative, but we also added acquisition in here. Because again, as I said, as consumers, we're part of the problem. We need to be more demanding, we need to be more informed. And so through the acquisition part of it, we include our acquisition working group, and Stan Wisseman is the co-chair of that. We have our acquisition that includes due diligence questionnaires, things you ought to be asking of your suppliers that you haven't been asking. And it depends if you're buying COTS or if you're actually contracting for somebody to develop software for you. Things you ought to be asking of them. And when you contract with them, there's actually sample language that you can use. And so what are the products? And these are all free for you. You can go on the web, you can download these, and you can start using these now. So it's our Build Security In website, the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, and our Software Assurance Community Portal. Those, through either one of those websites, it'll bring you to these resources. The first is our body of knowledge, which is primarily for curriculum developers, and that's either at the university level or if you've got training organizations. In fact, being announced tomorrow is a new certification on secure software development, so I'm not the one to be announcing that. We also have an organization for software systems security principles and guidelines, and again, for curriculum developers in basically integrating security into software engineering, computer science, or MIS curriculum. Our developers guide, Stan's going to talk a little bit more about that, but it really looks at how do you security enhance your existing product development lifecycle and where you can start making some touch points here. Our software security assurance state-of-the-art report really surveyed where we are, and this is now about a year old, as far as it baselined where we are globally, who's focused on software assurance, and what they're doing, and so it's a good starting basis. We have a system assurance guide. We're spending a lot of effort with standards bodies because, quite frankly, it's not sufficient just for the Department of Homeland Security or even the U.S. federal government to say this is important. We have to have it embodied within international standards, because standards are a common way that we communicate between suppliers and consumers, between government and industry, between insurance organizations and those that they insure. We also have a practical measurement framework for software assurance and information security, because we found that we don't have the right information to make decisions when it comes down to software security. We don't do measurement for the sake of measurement. We do it to provide the indicators so that you can become more informed. And through that, we're actually sponsoring work with the National Institute for Standards and Technology through our SUMMATE software assurance metrics and tool evaluation, where we qualify tools. Our ecosystem, it literally is a plug and play of tools. And why is that important? It's based on the common weakness enumeration. Steve Christie's in the back there. He's one of the lead supporters within that, within the MITRE Corporation. And this is work that we're funding to do this. It's a common way for us to talk about exploitable constructs within programs, within your code itself. And the beauty of having the ecosystem where tools that are compatible with that, literally one tool that report out exploitable weaknesses. I've had some people say, well, what do I do with that? In fact, some people said, I'd rather not know. But the reality is you can do two things. One is knowing those exploitable weaknesses in development, you can start cleaning them up. But if you don't have time to clean them up, or if you're a consumer and you can't do that, you can literally use one of the other tools that will use the output of the other and read those exploitable weaknesses, and it will apply a virtual patch. A virtual patch is a code wrapper or an application firewall. Now, from a consumer perspective, that's just as good, because while it doesn't fix the exploitable construct, it blocks the path to it. And that's really what we're looking for, is making sure that you can't be exploited. Stan's going to talk a little bit about our software assurance and acquisition, mitigating risk to the enterprise. We also have the software project management for software assurance state-of-the-art report. All of these are freely downloadable. You can use them. You can even republish them. We do ask that you at least give some recognition to where you got the material. And we're also putting out more, not just through the websites, but through various professional journals. In fact, this month's issue of Crosstalk, the journal, technology, tools, and product evaluation, and outsourcing, measurement, business case, and malware attribution. And the reason we've been working with malware, and specifically with the Anti-Spyware Coalition, is we found out that no organization likes their code called malicious. Don't call my code malware. Well, what we're looking at is code behavior. And well, how many of you think that a keylogger is a bad thing? Well, nobody's raising your hand, right? But it's like, some of you think that it is. That exact same keylogger could be used as part of a parental control. It just depends on how it was applied, and was it installed with user consent. If you install a keylogger and I don't know about it, and oh, by the way, it's gathering that information, now reporting back to the home company, I would consider that malicious. As I mentioned, the Software Security Assurance State-of-the-Art report is something that you ought to download. It gives you a very good baseline for getting started with this. If you wanted to get started today, every one of you I know has started focusing on security. Nod your head in agreement with that, because you have to understand how you're doing work today. We're not saying you have to do drastic changes, but start defining the relevant more, but also expose your security needs and requirements. Again, too often we're thinking that somebody should have explicitly told me what those were, but often customers aren't going to articulate security requirements down to the software level. You want to be able to integrate threat modeling during design. How many of you have done any type of threat analysis or threat modeling as part of your development activities? That's good. Do you realize you're actually a larger percentage of this population answers in the affirmative than in most cases. So you're at least aware of the value of what that brings to you. And integrate automated security code scanning. Now, I know you're using some form of tools. You have to be able to do this because just to do it within a few lines of code, we've given programmers 25 lines of code and we say within this 25 lines of code, there is an exploitable construct. We'd like you to find it and fix it. We found out that most can't find it. So without tools to enable this, we're not trying to replace good practices, but you have to have tools to support what you're doing. And you want to be able to define the metrics and goals associated with it. So if you look at your normal life cycle, everybody plan, designing, build, and deploying. I'm not going to say which was the proper way of reflecting that. But everybody today, I know you do some requirements analysis and your use cases. That's the best way of getting started with it. Architecture and detailed design, your coding and testing, and you support your fielded programs. But if you really want to make more resilient software products, you want to kind of enhance what you're doing. In addition to your use cases, you need to factor in abuse cases. And that's where what we've introduced, the common attack patterns, is it relates to the common weaknesses. We want to make sure that you bounce these common attack patterns against whatever you're developing. Your security requirements might be explicit, but don't assume that your customer is going to be explicit about defining that all the time. Introducing risk analysis early on. Your design review needs to also be risk-based and your test plans to be there. Code review still is one of the most important that we do. It's a practice that we've known, and that means a peer review. No single individual should be submitting something to a library without somebody else looking at it. Static analysis, specifically static code analysis using tools, should be introduced not just by your stand to be able to talk about, if you want to take advantage of a document that's being published literally this week. It's out now, and enhancing the development lifecycle to produce secure software. Stan?
Thanks, Joe. I just want to highlight a couple of the different work products we're working on, and following through what he was just talking about as far as integrating in security into the SDLC. You know, the big question is how. You know, it's great to preach that, but how do you actually do it? And what we're trying to do with this effort, this work product we produced, it's called the Enhancing the Development Lifecycle to Produce Secure Software. It's not to spin it one particular way or the other. You know, there are different ways. You've seen the Microsoft SDL. You have the touch points from Gary McGraw. There are different ways that have been proposed, but objectively provide some information about how you can enhance the lifecycle. Now, the Processes Working Group has been working on this for like 3+ years, and it's gone through. I want to draw a similarity to how Owasp does their projects. Just like Owasp, it's primarily a volunteer activity as far as participating. I want to help people understand how to do the upfront integration, the coding phase. You know, if you look at what we're doing with the secure coding principles and practices, some general principles and practices have been captured, but also gets into the specific coding languages and some recommendations there. The white box, gray box, and black box testing techniques that you can apply. And so one of the things that the primary author, Karen Gertzel, has done is done a great job of canvassing what's available out there. And if nothing else, I think this can be used as a great reference, similar to what they're trying to do with the Application Security Desktop reference, and leverage the bibliography, because there's a lot of great sources that she's pulled together to create this. Now, we've heard this from both Joe and Jeff this morning, that while you can create a lot of guidance, you know, one of the big challenges is that we're still unable to necessarily understand what it is that we're acquiring. You know, we need to be better informed, but many times what we're acquiring is a black box. You don't understand what they've done in their development life cycle. Have they embraced this mantra of that ultimately are going to be for that application when it's deployed, or the requirements that are going to be needed. What kind of tools can you use as far as the work statements or terms and conditions? How can you augment those for software assurance considerations? In the appendices, you know, we have some here I think that'd be worthwhile referencing. We have a pretty comprehensive glossary, just because, again, the audience is primarily the acquisition folks who don't necessarily have a clue about this space. So we try to have a pretty comprehensive glossary. For the due diligence questionnaires that Joe mentioned earlier, we spent a lot of time trying to come up with questions that should be thought of, and we divided them up by software type. And then within that, we have different software assurance concern areas, whether it be assurance case or the vulnerability management, development, how are they actually developing the software, software pedigree or history. And then finally, we have a lot of sample RFP and contract language, including what came out of Owasp as far as Jeff Williams and his effort. One of the things that we addressed in this document, as well as in the standards efforts that we're trying to push with ISO, and you'll see this in other documents within the software assurance initiative and the work products we're producing, is this concept of an assurance. And what we're trying to do there is basically say that if a vendor is claiming to be able to have a certain level of security and making different claims about their software, then they should be able to support those arguments with evidence. Okay? Now, how is that related to the acquisition side of the equation? Well, if you don't contractually ask for the work products and deliverables that would support that evidence, then you're really going to be hampering your ability to make that assurance case ultimately. So up front in your strategic planning and thinking about what ultimately are you going to need for an assurance case when you deploy this application, the contract shop needs to be told, well, what deliverables or work products throughout the supply chain, not necessarily just the prime, but ultimately those that are supplying the software components to, you know, whoever the prime might be, that you need to be able to have to make an assurance viable. And so again, that's something that we talk about here, and I just pulled one of the sections out of the questionnaires as far as questions you might ask about that help generate the evidence for assurance claims. And so that's just an area that we talked about. And I think the document again will be available in the next few weeks on the India. Okay, that's right. On the working group site you can get access to it, but it'll be available as a book form in a few weeks. And I think, Joe, you're going to wrap it up on business case.
So we understand that many people, while you really believe in this, you're still having a tough time convincing your seniors that we need to be doing this, either changing the way you do business, maybe even making an investment in that. And so we've already realized, and we've got this posted on our website, that an understanding that products with built-in security are more resilient and therefore cost less to sustain. It turns out it's not just the consumer who saves on this. Developers actually save money by building security in up front, and requires less rework prior to being put into use. We already have resources available to assist organizations and to integrate these security practices in the way you do business. We've got a lot of lessons learned to indicate a need to understand how to leverage the best practices to effectively implement application security tools and methods. And to help people, we're actually running a workshop at Carnegie Mellon at the end of this week it's going to be available, but also we've got a lot of people already participating in that. So get off the stage here, understand that your existing successful development practices should continue to go on, don't alter them significantly, but you can start embedding application security tools and application security practices into that life cycle today. It's not a wholesale change that you have to do. Whenever you do make those changes, do so incrementally. And one of the best things that you're doing is making sure that everyone is looking at security risk-based requirements consideration. Even if you're not doing formal threat modeling or threat analysis, ask each of your developers, since he or she's touching that code, what could go wrong, who could cause it, and how could it be done? If they're thinking about that during the development, they're already becoming a little bit more security focused. Embed that in your training and awareness. As we mentioned, resources are available. Come to our websites. Owasp, there's a very good partnership with what we've got through Owasp and our software assurance efforts that go on for